Great. I think we're ready to get started now. Welcome back. I hope you all had an enjoyable lunch. I also hope you didn't fill up too much because I think there's some food samples later. So if you've been smart, you've left a bit of room before that. Now, in just a few minutes, we're going to find out who the 3 finalists are in this race of becoming the world's best entrepreneur. But as always in shows like this, I'm going to stretch out your waiting period just a bit more. And in the meantime, bid a warm welcome to the Deputy General Director of Business Authority of Denmark, Anders Hoffmann, who will give a short speech on entrepreneurship in creative industries.
Well, thank you very much. To be honest, I have been asked to give difficult speeches in my life, but I think this one will top it all, because you just had something to eat. 99% of you are sitting waiting. I mean, let this guy stop so we can hear who's actually moving forward. And still I have to get 9 minutes of sort of intelligence presentation. So instead of giving you sort of a long PowerPoint with the 40 slides, I decided to answer 5 very, very basic questions, and then in the end come up with some of the insights we have from our research. The 5 questions is, of course, I mean, why talk about entrepreneurship? I mean, why get all of this started? I mean, some of you have maybe heard that Denmark is really keen on entrepreneurs. And I think in my view, entrepreneurship is all about creating value. And it's all about trying to capture some of that value you create back into the firm. So in our perspective, what we really want to achieve here is to have a way to get people to create the value. All of you create value. But the cool thing about being an entrepreneur is that you also have a business model for how to get some of that value back into your firm, so you will be able to scale it up. So that is what we are aiming at, to produce in Denmark more people that have that ability. Then the second question is, of course, I mean, why focus on creative industries? I mean, why not just leave them alone and look at pharmaceuticals? And I think the basic question there is that we also look at pharmaceuticals. But we do think in Denmark that there is a very, very strong increase in demand after products that have this flair of creativity, that is sort of built on creativity, that the skills from creativity within the sectors or completely different sectors using the creativity skills to produce something new. So we see a huge increase in demand worldwide, and given that we are Danes and we like to have jobs and we actually like to have a high standard of living, it's nice to be in those niches that really move forward. So we're really trying to create something unique here. A second reason why we are focusing on the creative industry is as a country, you really cannot start from scratch. If you want to develop something, you can't just go out there and say, okay, now Denmark would like to have a space industry. There's no way we will get that. You have to build on a platform. There has to be something in the ground that you could sort of start to nurture and make that grow up. And we do actually think that we have some old design firms in Denmark that have been well known for many years. We have some architects. So we have a long tradition of working within that space. And what we're trying to do is to reinvent that space, to move forward and actually come up with some very new product. So that was the second reason why the creative industries. Then, of course, I mean, why entrepreneurs in creative industry and why this creative business cup? I mean, why have a competition? And there is a good reason why we have this competition. One of the key challenges we found looking at creative industry was the lack of business skills, the lack of actually creating a business model that would ensure that all the value that you guys create, some of that is captured and moved back into the firm. So that was a key challenge for that. And you can then start to teach people that. You can say, okay, you can go out to the entrepreneurs and say, hey guys, I'm really smart. I will teach you to learn all about capturing value. Or you can have a competition. And then during that competition, you can teach people about capturing value. So to be honest, this is just, the whole thing about competition is a fake educational program. Because, I mean, those of you who have kids, you know, okay, how fast can you lay the table? And they will run. And so I think it basically, the first time we did this was the same thing. That if we really ask people to compete and ask them to compete about business, that's also why you have the business, creative business there. Then during the competition, they will learn more about business, because that is what the judges will ask them. What's your business model? How do you think? How can you scale that? How do you move that to the market? What are your competitors? All of these things that we knew was a challenge for creative industries. So those of you who are participating will hopefully have learned something during the competition. The second reason why we think this is such a good idea is that then we know the winner of such a competition would be an extremely good role model for the rest of the sector. And that is actually something that we have shown in our research, that role models do actually work. For instance, one of the things that is very often discussed in many countries is, oh, we lack female entrepreneurs. We have looked into that in extreme details. The cool thing about Dane is that we have information about everybody. So we have a social security number, and we are allowed to link everything. So we have done really detailed analysis is what is actually one of the most driving forces for women to become entrepreneurs. And one of the really, really good hints is whether their mother was an entrepreneur. It doesn't matter what their dad did. So for those of you who have daughters and are dads, like me, sorry, it's your wife that counts. So, and we really tried to analyze, and the reason why that worked was due to the role model. So we know that this role model is an extremely strong signal, and that is what we're trying to achieve here. Then why make it global? Well, the reason why making it global is that we are an extremely small country. So we really would like to engage with the rest of the world. And we think that both because we think that you can bring unique talent to us and thereby helping us reinvent the creative industries in Denmark, but also we do think that some of your markets is really nice and we would like to sell some stuff to you. But this particular cup is really much focusing on the first part, sort of moving talent into Denmark and getting some of the inspiration from all of your ideas and all of your creativity. And I think that is why we're so glad that we actually managed to get such a spread globally among your participants. I mean, I think when you look at the list of countries, you couldn't have picked them more randomly. They was like, okay, let's try, whoops, that one. And therefore, I think the inspiration for all of us based on that is extremely valuable. Then finally, I have two good advices based on our research. The first one is really, what is a successful firm? What makes firms successful? And I think it's very difficult to generalize that, but there's two things that stands out when we look at the data. The first of all is, of course, you have to focus on your customers. Everybody is saying that, and if you ask the people from Apple and all of these really cool places, they would say that, that's nonsense. If you ask the consumer what they want, they will give you a wrong answer. You have to show them what they can get. And of course, that's true. So when we talk about focusing on the consumers, it's not that you should ask and interview them. You should give them your product, your service, and see what they do with it. And observe them why they use it. And some of them will say, perhaps if this could go like that, that would be even better. So at a very, very early stage, get out and just give them something. And make them, if it's something they can play with, make them play with it and see how that works. And if it's something they use, try and see how they use it. And then go back and make iteration on that product. So this whole thing that going to the consumer, looking at it, getting feedback, and then reiterating your product, I think that's one of the key things for having success. The second one is, of course, all of you are much smarter than I am about how to run a firm and how to create a good business, but at some point, you will run out of steam. We can see that. We call it, in Denmark, we have something called the 7-year crisis. It's not the marriage part, it's actually in your business. If you look at the data, firms start up, a lot of energy, and you see there's a sort of, they start to increase, they start hiring people. At some point, they just level out. All firms do that, even the one that finally will end up being very successful. But the difference between the very successful and the rest is that at some point, they start to grow again. At some stage, there's a turning point where they re-engage in growth. And why do they do that? We can see two very distinct things that happen for those that reintegrate. One is that they get a very good board. So they completely change the structure that they have their firm. Most of you would own your own firm, so you don't have to have a board. But at some point you need it, because those would be the guys that would tell you, maybe you want to look at that market. Maybe you want to go into that segment. So get a board with some really professional people that are very much focused on the stage you're in development. You can change them after a year. You can just kick them out and get some new people in there. So it's not that you have to stick to those guys, but you have to have somebody. That would be one way to do it. The other way, which is also very significant in the data, is that you can hire somebody who used to work for McKinsey, IBM, whatever that is needed for you, but you used to work in a global firm and know about scales, know about the big things, the bigger picture. So those would be the two really good ways to sort of re-enter growth. So to sum up my 8 minutes, creative industries, like the ones you're in, are definitely one of the future industries. The key challenge would be understanding how to capture the value you create for your customers. And the way to do that would be to be really focused on how do the customers that you serve use the stuff you have, do iteration with them. That would put you on a growth path. And then at some point when you level out, please remember that this guy in Denmark told you to get a board or to hire somebody from a multinational firms. And that would make all of you very successful. So for the best of luck for your firm and for the competition, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I'm sure as entrepreneurs, you're all used to facing many, many challenges every day in your work. But today, there's a group of people who've probably faced a bigger challenge than any of you, at least today, namely the judges or the jury. They have been asked to do something that would have been impossible for me, find out who the 3 best pitches are, and give them the chance to win these amazing prizes. I'd like to now bid a warm welcome to the members of the jury that are here today. Ask them to join me on stage so we can all show our appreciation. First of all, Dash Balakrishnan from Malaysia. And Trevin McGowan and Julian McGowan from South Africa. Peter Kreiner from Denmark. Kavita M. Shukla from the United States. And also from the United States, Swaroop Samant. Andrei Korobainik from Estonia. And Jack Horner from United Kingdom. And we have Carla Mayumi from Brazil. And unfortunately, Jonathan Ortmans from the United States was not able to be here today, but I've been told that he participated yesterday in the jury deliberation. So please give a big warm hand to the jury. And now I will put some of you out of your misery, and we'll have, Julian McGowan announce who the 3 finalists are. I think you'll be getting one here.
Well, thank you very much for giving us a really tough task this morning. You all upped your game and moved things around a little bit. What we thought yesterday was all juggled around this morning, so thanks for that. Yeah. Before I give you the final 3, sorry, it has to be that, we'd like to give a special jury commendation of the young entrepreneur from Kenya. We were really charmed by your enterprise, and we hope it continues with such success. And I think you've probably got a few more in you as well, huh? So. Really. So this is not quite the Oscar moment, but these are the 3 finalists that we would like to pitch again. So in order of the pitch, it would be Norwegian Rain from Norway. Green Bow from Israel. And We Want Cinema from the Netherlands. So good luck, and thanks a lot.
Thank you for that. Now the 3 finalists will have a few minutes to think about your pitch, think it through again. And while you do that, the rest of us will have the opportunity to listen to what is surely going to be an interesting speech. The topic of our next speaker is creative economy. Is creative economy as much a state of mind and attitude as it is a definable sector of an economic strategy or activity? Our next speaker is a freelance strategist. He's a cultural entrepreneur, and he is the chairman of Creative England, a publicly funded agency to support creative businesses across England. Please give a warm hand to John Newbegin.
Thank you. So what's the creative economy in 20 minutes? That's a pretty tough job. And in the last day or two, I've been thinking a lot about how to pick up on some of the things that you've all been talking about. Because you could say, what's the creative economy? It's what you saw this morning, and I could then sit down. But I know you wouldn't like me to upset your timetable. So I was very struck this morning when the conversation got on to the difference between being a dreamer and being a realist. And it reminded me of a little joke, which really is nothing to do with anything we're talking about, but it's a good joke, I think. You'll know Sherlock Holmes, the fictional 19th century detective, and his sidekick, Watson. So Holmes and Watson are out camping for the weekend, and they're lying wrapped up in their blankets. It's the middle of the night. And Watson says, "Holmes, when I look up and see the stars, I think how insignificant we are, how wonderful the universe is, how splendid the world is." There's a silence. And he says to Holmes, "What are you thinking about, Holmes?" And Holmes says, "I'm thinking about the bastard who stole our tent." And so you can say that's the difference between the romantic and the realist, the dreamer and the realist. But also, it's about naivety and realism. And I was struck by Jack Horner citing Steve Jobs this morning, saying, "Be foolish." And it seems to me that one of the key qualities in an entrepreneur in the creative sector is you have to remain foolish, in the sense of being naive. And being foolish and being naive and being a dreamer are not quite the same thing, but they're all tied up together. So where to start on what's the creative economy? I mean, I think that I also want to pick up on something that Uffe Elbeck said this morning when he was talking about China. Because this notion that somehow we in the West are going to kind of move up the value chain and focus on wonderful design and creative industries and protecting our IP and all the rest of it, and leave the Chinese to carry on with making things is nonsense and is already outmoded. Apart from anything else, wage inflation in China is running at between 13 and 14%. They are beginning to price themselves out of some parts of the market, but they are thinking ahead. And as Uffe said, part of the 5-year plan at the moment is focusing on culture and on the creative industries. And one of the mantras in that 5-year plan is moving from made in China to designed in China. They absolutely see they need to move up the value chain. And that's happening around the world. The UNCTAD report of 2011 on the growth of the creative industries around the world estimates, and it's kind of dodgy numbers because it's very difficult to get solid data on this, that South-South trade in creative goods and services grew at an average of 20% a year from 2002 to 2008. So this thing is becoming an absolutely global phenomenon. And every government in the world is thinking about developing policies for the creative industries. The extraordinary thing is, as far as I can see, no two governments anywhere actually agree what the creative industries are. So there is a kind of issue there, but everybody is signed up to the proposition that the creative industries are important. And that means that the role of culture in our societies is radically different as well. And I've often thought that 30 or 40 years ago, this is back to my South-South point, 30 or 40 years ago, if a politician from one of the Western countries went to a country in Asia or anywhere in the so-called developing world, they would be taken to see a car factory or a steel plant or a shipyard as a symbol of modernization. Now they're taken to see the National Museum and the new concert hall, some cultural institution. All around the world, culture is being seen as one of the key definers and differentiators of the way economies work and the way societies work. And I do some work in Hong Kong where they're investing $3 billion in building a cultural center in West Kowloon. Now, in Hong Kong is the most money-focused place on the planet. If they're investing $3 billion in a cultural institution, it means that they recognize that that is an important part, not just of building the economy of Hong Kong, but establishing Hong Kong as the global city of Asia, which is how they're trying to rebrand it. And similarly, I do some work in Abu Dhabi, where even more crazily, you might say, than in Hong Kong, the government, until the crash of 2008, was planning to invest $17 billion in building cultural centers on a sandbar about 100 meters off the coast of Abu Dhabi. And I was doing some work with them and said, is this not just either a little bit ambitious or a little bit crazy? And they said, no, because if you look at the way the demographics of the world are changing, by 2025, the professional middle classes of India and China will probably exceed in number the entire population of the European Union. So actually, we don't care if you guys go out of business because they are our market. And that's not a market for goods in a kind of in a conventional manufacturing sense. That's a market for culture. It is absolutely enormous, and it's growing in its significance. And apart from the middle classes of India and China, if you think that now the number of cell phones in the world almost equals the number of people, and increasingly, everywhere in the world, people have got access to some form of handheld device. I was in Nairobi recently, and a group of young people from Kibera, working with some entrepreneurs, were just back from New York, having won a Grammy for a fantastic piece of social media that they've created in Nairobi. So this is not us in Europe thinking about our creative industry policy being out front in the world. This is something which is absolutely global, and increasingly there's an exchange of good ideas. There's a kind of mutuality about it, and that's something which I'd like to come back to in a moment. But before I do that, part of all this seems to me, it's also no accident that at the same time that all this is happening, we're beginning to recognize that GDP is a very poor indicator of national well-being. And, President Sarkozy commissioned Joe Stiglitz and Amartya Sen to do some work with the French government on defining better indicators of national well-being than simply economic growth. And the same is happening in the UK, the work of Richard Layard. So again, all around the world, people are thinking how we value what is going on in our societies is changing. Not just how people value things, but how governments value things, and how they have to value things, and how they project themselves, and how they project their distinctiveness around the world. And it does seem to me that that's a very profound change which government itself has not caught up with yet, because it is also about having to integrate the way our economic policy and our education policy and our cultural policies merge together. And state institutions are way, way behind in all that kind of area. And if you think that actually our discussion of creative industries seems to me is moving very rapidly now into an area where we talk about the creative economy rather than creative industries. And the creative economy is something which is much more broadly based than just the creative industries. And it's about attitudes, but it's also about new paradigms. And to me, the symbol of those changes in attitudes is dependent on something which was also being talked about on this platform yesterday, and that's about education and our approach to education. And the extent to which, in most countries and in most education institutions in most countries, with some very honorable exceptions, we are still training young people for an industrial society which is rapidly evaporating. It's not that in the last 150 years the majority of people have worked in factories, have ever worked in factories, but our education system has at quite a kind of basic level been designed for training people for the factory system, i.e. punctuality, i.e. accepting orders, i.e. doing repetitive tasks, i.e. doing what you're told and not causing trouble. These are the kind of essential qualities which have been seen as an important part, of course not the whole part, but an important part of what an education system's doing. And now we're beginning to recognize how completely inappropriate that is for the world that we're moving into. And 2 or 3 little quotes, I think, illustrate that. One is, again, something that was touched on yesterday. A guy called Geoffrey Crossick, who's the Vice-Chancellor at University of London, a very progressive thinker in this area. And he said recently, the problem we have running a major institution like London University is that we're training graduates for jobs that don't exist. This has become a kind of cliche, but it's true. What does an education institution do for paradigms of the economy that are changing so rapidly? And then I think of something else, which is the work of a great Bangladeshi social entrepreneur and activist called Muhammad Yunus. And I don't know, many of you will have heard of him, but I was going to tell an anecdote, I won't. I may run out of my 20 minutes. One of his lines is, if you take a job, all that means is that you're taking it from somebody else. If you make a job, you're growing the world economy. I was doing a talk in Portugal about a year ago to a group of postgraduate students, many of them in architecture and design. And in the course of discussion, I came up with this quote, and a guy jumped up in the front row, and he said, "That's true of everybody in this row." He said, "None of us are looking for jobs because the Portuguese economy is screwed. So we're not looking for jobs, we're making jobs." And I thought that was an extraordinary statement of somebody thinking about the world in a completely different way and a completely entrepreneurial way. And it's not the kind of thing that our education system has been good at dealing with. And then my final little quote is from the training manual, the staff manual of the Cisco organization. Cisco, as I'm sure you'll all know, is not a kind of small entrepreneurial startup. It's a huge US multinational that employs, I don't know, 60, 70,000 people around the world. But one of their core mantras is, "It is better to ask forgiveness than seek permission," which is a pretty radical thing for any company to tell its employees. And I must say, I did ask the Cisco senior manager in the UK how many employees have been sacked as a result of believing this too literally. But it is the case that that is how Cisco recognize that they need to build their business. If they're going to grow and prosper, they have to empower their employees to take risks. That's in a big corporation. So you take those three things together and you realize the extent to which the attitudes that underpin most of our education system are completely and hopelessly out of date and inappropriate. Yeah. Okay. And as part of that, come back to Steve Jobs again. I mean, another of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes is when asked why Apple was so successful, he said, "Because we don't employ computer geeks, we employ poets, artists, and musicians who are deeply interested in computing and computer science." Now, again, you may say that was a kind of cynical piece of marketing on the part of Steve Jobs, but I don't think it was. And again, that's such a kind of powerful statement of the fact that we need to be thinking about how we integrate things which we have allowed, really, in the last 150 years of our Western societies developing, to become completely disaggregated from each other. And if you look at the way government is organized, we are operating still on a completely 19th and 20th century model. I think it's really interesting that it is in the Nordic countries and the Baltic states where there have been some real attempts to try and change this. In Helsinki, Aalto University in Helsinki, they've collapsed the engineering college and the business school and the art school into one institution, a university for creativity. That's a pretty radical step. And for me, it's a little kind of statement of where we need to be going with our thinking, of what needs to happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And some governments, two countries that I've been in recently, in Latvia, and strangely, to me it felt strange, in Macedonia, where the economics ministry, the education ministry, the culture ministry, and the regional development ministry have said we have got to stop having separate silos and learn how we work together, because if we're not working together, we're not going to be creating the kind of society and the kind of economy we need for the 21st century. So there's some pretty radical changes coming down the track at every single level, from the way companies work to the way governments need to organize themselves. And it seems to me some of the other paradigms, again, many of them picked up in the last 24 hours here. In this new world, every micro business is a global business, potentially. What does that mean? It is extraordinarily true how rapidly people are adapting to that. But we haven't really thought about some of the implications of that. It comes back to my point about mutuality. It means that people who have common interests wherever they are in the world can work together on projects and can identify niche markets. Secondly, something that's come up here endlessly, this is so much more about people than it is about companies. Of course, companies matter. And of course, it is important as an entrepreneur to move on from building a project to building a business and learning how you value the intellectual property that you're generating and how you scale your business and how you systematize innovation. But so much of it is still down to people. It's about networking. And the fact that if you look at the kind of global investment figures at state level, what's been happening over the last 10 or 15 years is that the proportion of total investment that's gone into tangibles, i.e. factories, machinery, physical infrastructure, is declining proportionately, and the proportion of investment that goes into intangibles, which is basically people and software, that's going up. And in most of the West European economies and in the US, investment in intangibles now exceeds quite significantly the investment in tangibles. That's a really fundamental change in the way our economies work. So it's another real kind of paradigm shift. And another thing I was struck by yesterday, sorry, it's a bit of a kind of ramble, but I've been trying to pick up all the things that have hit me in the last 24 hours. Those presentations we heard yesterday about the way businesses have changed the way they work by working with artists, they were wonderful and kind of life-affirming. I just, welders dancing, welders creating a statue of chaos. I just thought that's kind of a magic moment I will treasure. But actually, there's something more profound than that going on, because all those examples we saw yesterday, I think, were really saying you can use the arts and culture to make your business work better. But the really radical thing that's happening about the relationship between the new creative economy and traditional businesses is that the new thinking of the creative economy is not just changing the way those businesses work, it's changing what they do. And again, 3 quick examples. We're doing a lot of this in Creative England now. We're brokering little creative content firms with technology companies working across health services and engineering and all kinds of different disciplines. And one of my mantras is to say, you think you're working in the entertainment sector if you're in film, television, games, but you're not in the entertainment sector. You are, but you're also right across the whole economy. So I talked to this guy who's driving a major research project for Rolls-Royce on their next generation of fuel-efficient engines. And he said, oh, you'll be interested in this. All the software we use is games industry software. Yeah, I am interested in that. And he said, and actually, we're beginning to hire coders from the games industry because they are better able to make some of the conceptual leaps that we need to have made than conventionally trained engineers. So this is probably the highest end manufacturing company in the UK, employing people out of the games business. I mentioned this to a guy who runs a company called Aardman Animation in Bristol, which makes cartoon characters Wallace and Gromit. I don't know if any of you have come across Wallace and Gromit. And he laughed, and he said it's exactly the same thing in Bristol. Airbus have a big research facility in Bristol. He said, we fight Airbus for the best coders. I thought, this is kind of interesting. And then I came across another story from Australia last week. A research project in Australia looking at the way in which very bespoke products and physiotherapy services could be devised for people with major motor issues, problems with moving as a result of accidents or paralysis or surgery or whatever. So it's called gait analysis. I mean, not the gate you open and shut, but gait the way you walk. It's a technology called gait analysis. It was developed for the medical profession in Australia, but when they started making Lord of the Rings in New Zealand, they realized they could repurpose the technology to be part of the kind of driving force in a lot of the CGI that drove the Avatar. So I thought, here is a development which has simultaneously a use in films and a use in medical technology. Another example, a guy who was running one of the major TV companies in the UK said to me about 10 years ago, the big issues that we have to face in health and health costs in our societies over the next 50 years are all going to be about lifestyle. And if we're going to be dealing with lifestyle issues, that means really we have a communications and a media issue. We all know that doctors are not terribly good at communicating. If the government was being really logical, what they'd do is allow the TV company, the public service broadcasters, to run the health service and subcontract the hospitals back to the medical profession. And again, a rather kind of extreme statement, but there's an example of clinical problems which we still imagine need to be resolved in clinical terms are often open to completely non-clinical solutions. The Design Council in the UK did a big project called Design Out Bugs to try and reduce infection in hospitals, not looking at infection from a clinical point of view, but from the products that were being used in the hospital, the redesigned products. They wound up with things that were cheaper to make, easier to clean. Infections went down. And one more little example from that, because I think this is absolutely the core of what goes on, as I understand it, in this institution. Oh, I'm losing my microphone. A company we were talking with in Cambridge, who were asked by the health service to look at the way asthma inhalers work. A lot of kids, growing number of kids in the UK, and I suspect it's true right across Europe, have asthma, breathing problems when they're young. They hate the inhalers and they don't use them properly. They spend a lot of money thinking through the whole process by which whatever it is pumped into the lungs when you inhale. But the solution they came up with was to work with a games company and embed a tiny video clip into the inhaler so that when you inhale, a golf ball rolls across a green. If you do it correctly, the ball goes into the hole. If you don't, it goes around the hole. So the kids, rather than saying, I don't want to use my inhaler, Mum, they play the game until they get the ball in the hole. The health service on their clinical trials said this will probably save us £400 million over the next 10 years in reduced hospitalization costs. So then you start thinking, when you pull all these things together, our state institutions are not really yet geared up for the creative economy. Our businesses are beginning to be. But if you went to the health department or you went to your finance department and said, if you want to reduce health costs in our society, what you ought to be doing is investing in video games, they'd think you're crazy. But actually, that is where a lot of the solutions are emerging. And we've got to be thinking in these really broad terms, because that's where the big game lies. And that's why, going back right to the beginning, Sherlock Holmes may be naive, maybe a dreamer, whatever, but not only is this sector of growing importance, but it actually seems to me is one of the kind of key components that we need to start playing in on a much, much bigger game, not just about how our countries survive as nations and how we continue to provide public services of the kind that I've just been talking about, but if you look at it on a really big scale, capitalism is like a bicycle. It has to keep growing, otherwise it falls over. And since about 1780, the capitalist economies need to grow 3% a year. It's been almost exactly 3% a year when times are good. We have a crash, then creative destruction, things kind of unwind a bit, then we're back on 3%. We've got 7 billion people living on the planet. We'll soon have 9 or 10. We cannot go on having a kind of economy which is dependent on 3% growth in manufacturing the kind of goods and services that are so energy intensive and so wasteful in every way as the ones that we've been producing for the last 100 years. So again, coming back to what CKO is doing, looking at the way the experience economy works, looking at the way people's quality of life can be enhanced and people's standard of living can be enhanced and value can be created by developing things which are not commodities that require wasteful use of natural resource and huge amounts of energy, but are nevertheless creating value and are making the quality of people's lives better. If we're not thinking about how we embed that right at the core of the way our economies work and our societies work, the planet is in very, very serious trouble. So that may sound a very grand claim, but I think, we look at the creative industries, all of us who are enthusiastic about it, lots of people outside this room wouldn't have a clue what we are talking about when we talk about the creative industries or the creative economy. Not only is it important, not only is it growing, not only is it something which every government in the world is now engaged in, but actually, I think it's going to be a rather crucial way of making sure that we have a planet which, in 30, 40 years' time, is sustaining a quality of life and a material quality of life and a standard of living which means that most of the people on the planet can have a reasonable prospect of having a life that's worth living. And that's a very, very big game indeed. And so I finish up by saying, if I've got this point, I'll finish up with a quote from an archbishop. The Archbishop of Canterbury, writing a piece in the New Statesman magazine in the UK a few weeks ago, talked about the fact that a functioning economy is one where there is the growth of mutual capacity. And I think one of the interesting things about the paradigms that we're creating with the creative economy is that an awful lot of it is about creating mutual capacity. Several of the judges this morning, when they're talking about their own businesses, and I think, Jack, you particularly were talking about that competition is also, it's co-competition, it's collaboration and competition. And going back to my quotes from Mohammed Yunus and from Cisco and so on, there is a change in the way small businesses work. And they're tiny businesses, most of them still, compared with the big corporations that run the world economy. But embedded in that are the possibilities of real change, of working in a different way, of looking how we create value in a different way, and giving people a very, very different experience of their lives and works, whether they're employed directly in the creative industries as we choose to define them today, or whether they are just people trying to get by and make a living. We are in a process of real shift of the basic paradigms, and that's what seems to me is the important thing about the creative economy. Not how much it's worth, not how many people work in it, but the symbol of what it says about the way the world economy and our society needs to develop and change in the next 20 years. Okay, thanks.